Welcome to Advertising Champions, your go-to destination for insights into the dynamic world of advertising. I'm Tony Stanol, and with us today is Tim Mattimore, who is with Mattimore Creative. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you so much, Tony. Great to be here with you.
Now, I've known you over the years. You've worked at several top-notch agencies. Why don't you walk us through your career path and what you're up to these days?
For sure. So very briefly, I'm from New York originally, and I went to school at the Fashion Institute of Technology in Manhattan and really went quickly to work after that in the city. And I worked for a number of agencies, independent shops in New York. I worked for Gray for a time. And then I was in Chicago for a shoot for the Foot Locker and Nike brands. And I had never been to Chicago before. Instantly fell in love with that city. I'm a big fan of architecture. And I remember looking in my refrigerator in New York, and there was probably like a ramen noodle and a tomato that was rotting. And I was like, God, what am I doing in this city? I can't afford to be here any longer. So I decided to pick up and leave. I moved to Chicago with my then girlfriend, who was brought up in the suburbs of Chicago. And I wound up scoring a gig with Energy BBDO, where I was really lucky enough to meet some amazing people. I worked on some great Wrigley brands and just had a blast. After that, I was recruited by Fallon to come up to Minneapolis, to the Twin Cities, to work for them. And Bruce Bildston, who's a good guy, a good friend of mine. Met some terrific folks. And although that agency was going through, I wouldn't call it turmoil, but it was going through a change of guard with Jeff Kling coming in as the CCO. So I wasn't there that long and wound up heading back to Chicago for a brief stint, and then went to Commonwealth McCann in Detroit, where I worked on Chevrolet for about 3 years, then went back to this was supposed to be a short answer, I know.
Yeah.
But then I went back to...
Our time is almost up, Tim. Keep going.
From Detroit, where, again, I had a blast. I met my wife there, who's a producer in the business. And I left there to become the executive creative director at BBDO Minneapolis. And then I was recruited by Digitas out of Chicago. So I once again left BBDO after about 3 years and stayed with Digitas for 3 years.
Right. And the Digitas job, I remember that. It was a big job. You oversaw a lot of people. But since then, you decided to take a sabbatical of sorts. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So, and first, I would love to just say that I'm under no illusions that I've led a privileged life, and I don't think that the world right now needs another middle-aged white man talking about struggles when there are so many folks out there who are truly struggling. But I hope that what I can talk about in my experience there and taking a break from the business is not unique, and people can relate to it, because I think that there are some things that I discovered in leadership that I wasn't prepared for, quite frankly. And I think that I was with Digitas for 3 years. I actually gave notice in June of last year. And I gave the agency and my friends there a pretty wide berth. I was like, I'll stay around for as long as you might need me. And I wound up being with the agency until December 15th of last year. But there were some things that happened during my experience there that really struck me in not so great ways, and that my mental health was starting to suffer really, pretty heavily. And with that, compounded with that, came some physical things that started to happen. I was getting panic attacks. I was actually, I was sleeping, and this is, again, not unique to me, but I was sleeping like 3-4 hours a night. I was just completely fried. I began having blurred vision at times, dizzy spells. And I'm grateful for my wife, who is, we, of course, were working from home and we were sitting together, and she would look at me and just say, "This has to stop. You need to resign. Like, you need to get out of this, because I'm just seeing my person who's killing himself right now." So I decided I heeded her advice, and I left the agency, and I've been taking a break to try to figure out, what's next for me. How can I work in a better capacity with a better balance? And also, when I resigned, I told my boss, and this was semi jokingly, I told him that this job is like 85% people complaining, talking about allocations, talking about short staff, talking about having no money, and the other 15% was dedicated towards spending time with my teams and creativity. And that balance for me was just not right. I'm a maker. I like to be in the work, and I'd like to be a part of it. And the grind just truly started to hurt me. And I think in hindsight, I was thinking about this last night, because I think that one of the things, and again, I hope that anybody who's in a leadership role, really in any, outside of even the advertising business, I don't know that any of us were properly prepared for what was to come during the pandemic. And I certainly don't want to talk about the pandemic and relitigate that thing. We've all talked about it ad nauseum, but I found myself in a position where, and again, this is not unique to me, but I found myself in this position where I had to become something that was different than a creative director or a creative lead. You had to become a therapist for people. I wasn't prepared for my team members to be, in tears over Zoom, just talking about how lonely they were, and all that stuff, which anybody who has some empathy can relate to. You really you care for these folks, and that was something that no one's giving us psychiatry schooling and stuff like that. So
right.
yeah,
Well,
it was difficult for sure.
Sounds like you made the right decision. You're recharging your batteries. We'll see what's next for Tim Mattimore. Thanks for sharing your what turns out to be somewhat of a cautionary tale for a lot of us.
Yeah, you bet, Tony. It's my pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Advertising Champions. You could find out more about our podcast at dailynewsnetwork.com. And we'll see you next time.
We've been around for 16 years, working with clients, with thousands of clients. We're working with agencies to be able to scale them and grow them and provide them services that would cost them way more than it would for them to do it themselves. Anything oriented around lead generation, video creation, web design, we're full service, so we can really serve most people.